Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. You're also a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mark, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Of course, the Senate passed a $95 billion foreign aid bill earlier this month that would send money to support Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. You co-wrote a piece for the National Review that said, quote, supporting America's allies puts America first. Break this down for us. How does that put America first?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me for this important discussion, because I really believe this. And whether it's this $95 billion one or the $60 to $65 billion one that's being generated within the House right now, both of them, in terms of security investments, do the same thing. They put about $40 billion into Ukraine security systems. Now, what that is $40 billion that goes to one of three things: Presidential Drawdown Authority, that is pulling older gear from the U.S. Army, and then at U.S. companies buying replacement gear. That's about a third of the money. Another third of the money would go to going straight to American companies and buying something to be shipped to U.S. European Command in Stuttgart and given to the Ukrainians. And then the final third is to pay for the operations of U.S. European Command throughout this crisis, which is going to happen no matter what. And if they don't give that money, then there'll be a hole in the Department of Defense budget. So very specifically, all the gear that we're talking about, about $28 billion, $29 billion worth of gear is bought in the United States. The money never leaves here. It's not corrupted. It's not stolen, unless you think the U.S. Defense Industrial Base steals your money. It's not stolen. It goes to Florida, Georgia, California, Arkansas, Michigan, not Kiev, Moscow, anywhere else. There's another $14 billion in there that's very much military assistance for Israel. It's $4 billion worth of gear to replace their army munitions that they've expended in Gaza, $4 billion of FMF that I think will go towards munitions for their aircraft, to help deter anything that would happen on their northern front with Lebanon, and about $4 billion for Iron Dome and David Sling, their kinetic cruise missile and mortar defense systems they've expended a lot of the weapons on in the Gaza right after the Gaza attack on October 7th and since then, and another $1.2 billion for Iron Beam, a directed energy system they're trying to develop. And then finally, there's $4 billion in there for Taiwan. And I love this. It's a small number, but the reason it's a small number is the war hasn't started. If you make these investments before left of boom, you can kind of achieve deterrence for a much lower cost. And this is $4 billion to complement the vastly growing Taiwan defense budget, which is now up at 2.5% of GDP. But obviously pales in comparison to the Chinese spending. China's 20 times the size of Taiwan's economy. So three different countries serviced by about $60 billion worth of important security investments.
I want to talk about those investments later, but to your point, there hasn't been a war that has started between China and Taiwan yet. So can you specifically talk about the threat that Taiwan faces from China?
Yeah, that's very important, because this is all about the United States, Taiwan, and our other allies, principally Japan and Australia, creating the conditions where when the Chinese leader Xi Jinping gets up in the morning, looks in the mirror, he has to say, not today. Because we've created a deterrent force that could overwhelm any type of attack he had. There is no doubt that in the Chinese long-range strategic planning, they stated very clearly, by 2049, Taiwan will be part of a fully integrated part of China. More specifically, we know that Xi told his military to be ready by 2027 to execute this. They may or may not get there, but we have made our own investments since the middle of the Trump administration and through the Biden administration that have made it much harder for China. But you have to consistently apply this. We have to consistently be developing our forces. We have to be developing our own munitions. Our munitions were in a terrible condition, really only exposed by the Ukraine invasion, where we looked at all our depots and said, oh my, we're in trouble. We have to invest in the Taiwan so that they're kind of a prickly pear, very, they call themselves a porcupine, hard to digest, which means they have mine warfare systems, anti-armor systems, all those kind of things. And then finally, we need Japan and Australia to be fully committed to working with the United States to deter China and, if necessary, defeat China if it tries to do something inappropriate towards Taiwan. So really, you got to bring all those elements together. And this $4 billion in this budget will go a long way along with what the United States is routinely investing in its defense budget.
Critics of foreign aid, specifically to these countries, have said things to the effect of, this isn't America's problem. We should put America first. Can you talk about the national security threats that we're specifically facing from China, Russia, and Iran?
Thanks. And I think by putting them all together, it makes it kind of clear. If you're going to say, I don't care about Russia and what Russia does in Europe, well, that's 23% of the world's GDP we can no longer easily and transparently trade with. If you're going to say we don't care about China and Asia, well, that's 34% more of the world's GDP we can no longer work and trade with. And if you can say we don't care about the Middle East and Israel, there's 10 more percent. After a while, what do you think that we can run this U.S. economy on trade with Canada and Mexico alone? We won't get the kind of like growth and development. The United States is the leader. I mean, I'm not arguing for or against globalization. I'm just stating the clear fact that the United States, benefits greatly from the world trade system. The fact that it's free and fair and run by U.S. system, funded by the U.S. dollar. With U.S. dollar as the core currency, and U.S. companies do almost all the information systems and financial service systems management of this. So we need the world economy to be working in a normal functionary way. If you allow these authoritarians to assert themselves, countries will have to make decisions about who they ally with. And if they throw in with the other side, eventually that reduces the piece of the pie that we can work with. And so, yes, it's a core fundamental national security interest of the United States to have allies and partners out there with whom we can work and trade with. It's how we make money.
I had a really interesting conversation over the summer with North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, and at the time he was running for president, and we were talking about threats that the United States faces, and he said the U.S. is currently in a Cold War with China and actually at war with Russia. What do you think of his statement there? Do you find any truth to that?
So I would say we are in a very aggressive competition with China that could easily be framed as a Cold War. It's different than the Cold War of the Soviet Union because of the economic, intertwining of the intertwining of our economies. But his description of Russia, I think, is a little. I think we're probably in a warm, crisis or contingency with them because there are not U.S. troops. Very explicitly, there are not U.S. troops in Ukraine. We're trying to prevent exactly what he fears by confronting the Russians in Ukraine. If we allow Putin to have his way with Ukraine, he won't go for NATO next. He has issues to resolve in Georgia. He has issues to resolve in Moldova. But then he's going to look at the Baltics. And once he does that, he could easily get us into a hot war. I will add that since he said that to you, October 7th happened. And I think much more clearly, we're in a increasingly warm, headed towards hot war with Iran. Iran funded Hamas. They trained Hamas. They may not have given the exact go signal, but they benefited the most from Hamas's attack as it broke apart Israeli-Saudi normalization. They're funding Hezbollah in the north. They're training Hezbollah in the north. They're funding all the Shiite, the proxy groups in Iraq and Afghanistan that attack our forces, and they're funding and training and supplying and equipping the Houthis in Yemen. So we're in a fairly warming conflict with Iran on 4 different fronts at least. So I would say things are as bad as Governor Burgum implied, possibly getting worse.
To your point about Russia, I've asked Republican members of Congress specifically, let's say Putin steamrolls Ukraine, there could be a World War III on our hands. That's what other lawmakers and politicians have said. But some Republicans I've talked to said that type of language is fear-mongering. Do you think that's fear-mongering? What do you make of their characterization?
So first, I would characterize this as all Republican congressmen should visit Ukraine. After touring the battlefield, meeting with the Ukrainian leadership, military and civilian, and President Zelensky, if you walk out of there saying, we don't need to help these guys, I respect you. I would say the number of people that might do that, instead of the 115 plus House Republicans that are opposed, you might end up with 15. But they actively refuse to go do that visit because this isn't fear-mongering. Putin is not, some cozy bear who's misunderstood. Zelensky is not a Nazi. Ukraine is a democracy. uh, Russia is an authoritarian regime attempting to exert its way. If we don't step in here, when a big country tries to do this to a small country, first, what do we stand for? Do we stand for just the USA? I would be disappointed. I served in our military for 40 years. My son's serving now. I would be disappointed if all we stood for was what can we get out of this? But on top of it, it is in our national security interest, both economically and future conflict wise, to take care of Russia now. Let's be clear. We've spent total, the 60 billion in security assistance we've given is less than 2% of our defense spending over the same time frame of the last 2 years. So for less than 2% of our own defense spending, we've been able, which some of those same House Republicans say is, fraudulent anyway, for less than 2% of that, we've been able to stymie the world's largest ground army and support a democracy standing for itself. I think that's a phenomenal return on investment. It's not fear mongering, it's doing the right thing. And before you say that, you need to visit Ukraine, talk to Zelensky in person, and then come out. And if you still think that way, I respect you for it. Otherwise, I think you're just blowing hot steam.
To your point, do you think the Republican Party is becoming more isolationist?
Well, certainly the Senate isn't, right? We saw that in the Senate. They're not. Nikki Haley doesn't sound like that. Many, many, many of the Republican candidates running for president did not sound like that. And I think very close to a majority of the House Republicans don't sound like that. I think it's a very close vote right now. But if the Senate supports it, broadly, Senate Republicans, and we're very close in the House, I would say the Republican Party is at a precipice. Then they can still take a step in the right direction. So I certainly haven't given up hope at all in that regard. I think there's absolutely an opportunity here. And look, there's a little bit of politics involved in this, between the two presumptive presidential candidates. And so I think if you were to remove that from the room, you might get a slightly different vote that would show that more House Republicans support this than don't. Very few House Republicans would say out loud, I think Vladimir Putin is an okay guy, or I think Vladimir Putin is someone I can work with. I think most of them understand exactly who Vladimir Putin is.
So if it wasn't an election year, do you think this would have a different turn?
Absolutely. It did. The last two votes that weren't election years were pretty clean through. And so I think absolutely politics has something to do with this. And that's unfortunate. Politics, is supposed to end at the water's edge. National security is supposed to be a bipartisan issue. There are places where both parties violate this, whether it's progressive Democrats complaining about our support to Israel or some House Republicans complaining about Ukraine. I think politics is way too much creeping into what should be a very clean discussion of U.S. national security interests.
You mentioned earlier in the conversation the economic benefits the U.S. could gain from this foreign aid. And in your piece for the National Review, you quoted U.S. Senator Roger Wicker, and this was the quote. The United States' economy also stands to gain as 75% of the bill's funding will go to Americans, including $59 billion for weapons productions. In a conversation that I had with Congressman Tim Burchett earlier this month, he said he is not supporting additional funding for Ukraine because it, quote, or it has the industrial war complex's, quote, fingers all over it. What do you think of his characterization?
So I guess it's damned if we do, damned if we don't on this, right? If it goes overseas, it's susceptible to corruption. If it stays domestically, it's susceptible to defense industrial base. Here's what I'd say, and I think it's important because those numbers are slightly different than mine, and that's because that also accounts for humanitarian assistance. That other 25% is humanitarian assistance going directly to Israel or to Ukraine. But of the $59 billion in security assistance, which is 59 out of 61 billion total, so like I said, 95%, it goes to U.S. companies. And look, they weren't asking for this. I nowhere have I heard that U.S. companies were complicit with Vladimir Putin in initiating this war. They are the companies that are building the system. This is really not like new work in terms of like they've designed a new weapon system. It's 155 millimeter ammunition, Javelin missiles, AMRAAM missiles, some tank modernizations. These are not the kind of high profit jobs that the defense industrial base, the kind of like heavy R&D, research and development, next generation weapon systems where you tend to spend a lot of money. Look, they're making money on this. There's no doubt about it. They're creating jobs on this. There's no doubt about it. But I don't think this is some kind of plan of the defense industrial base, to significantly alter U.S. spending.
You're clearly the expert here. So what do you think is missing from the national conversation when it comes to foreign aid?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that question because it really is. It's about it. It is a look. Foreign assistance is a two-headed coin. One part is what are you doing for a partner or ally, and you want to make sure that partner or ally is someone who shares our values and interests, committed to democracy, committed to free trade, to transparency, to a rules-based system where our companies can operate in their country and their companies can operate in ours. Ukraine meets that mark. Israel meets that mark. Taiwan meets that mark. But the other side of the coin is it's in U.S. national and economic security interests to have countries like that available around the world and to have the other countries see that we were willing to step in and do the right thing. So an alliance with the United States, is a meaningful, acceptable solution for them. Very few countries see a world where they can be our economic the economic partner of choice can be the United States, but their security partner of choice is China, Russia, Iran. They all know China, Russia, and Iran won't allow that they'll be drawn in economically and be cut off from us. So the coin has two sides, one that's beneficial for our ally and partner, and one that's beneficial for us.
And as we sit here today, who do you think is the biggest national security threat that we face? China, Russia, or Iran?
I think the long-term pacing threat is China. It's the one for which there's not a guarantee, which I could not sit here and say, I know the exact investment path to success. If you asked me how do you deal with Russia, I can explain it to you. If you ask me how to deal with Iran, I can explain it to you. And those are both very economically feasible, executable plans. The one that's hard is China. China is a very, their economy is about 90% the size of ours. Their cost of labor is significantly less. They've had a significant amount of intellectual property theft from us. So they're really well positioned. And geographically, they're obviously much closer to the areas we might contest with them in the Western Pacific. So that's a big challenge for us. So if you ask me what's the biggest challenge for us, it is the China one.
And to your point, how do you see the U.S. dealing with Russia and dealing with Iran?
So with Russia, I do think it's here in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin made a horrific misstep in February 22. There's no way in February of 2022 that he thought it was anything other than a 1 week to 2 week campaign. We know that from the captured documents. We know that from their logistic support, their planning, their targeting. This was a 2 week campaign. He does not have the large scale maneuver army he thought he had. His Air Force has not been able to get air power going. He has been stymied by a small state, 1/3 the size of his, backed up admittedly by the United States and European partners, but with no troops. So, to me, the way to continue to stymie him is to stymie him in Ukraine, keep him there. There are natural instabilities in his system. He runs basically an autocracy where he's killed, an authoritarian regime where he's killed many of the oligarchy, who surround him. So from my point of view, there is a timestamp on that regime, and it will come due, reasonably soon. So we just need to continue to counter him in Ukraine.
And what about
Iran? For Iran, it's fully support Israel. Make sure that they can defeat Hamas completely, get their hostages back, restore Gaza to the Palestinians, allow the Saudis and others to kind of fund the recovery of that, and then present a strong deterrent face to Hezbollah. Iran can be backed down with strong deterrent actions by the United States and Israel. And there's no doubt in anyone's mind that Israel will take the actions required. On occasion, there's questions about us, but most recently, we've been striking pretty hard against the Houthis and against the IRGC groups in Syria and Iraq. So I think as long as we continue that strong positioning by Israel and by ourselves, rearm Israel, we'll be in a strong position vis-a-vis Iran.
Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, thank you so much for your expertise and insights. You are welcome back anytime.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a lot of fun.